I'm Jason Pack, and welcome back to a special two-part episode of Disorder. Yesterday, we commemorated the October 7th massacres. We gave an overview of the first year of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And today, we're going to look at the Palestinian issue on the international stage, the case for Palestinian statehood, Britain's unique role in the Israel-Palestine conflict historically and today, and what Britain, the US, and the UN can do to resolve the conflict and to bring about Palestinian statehood. So let's jump back into the issues with Sir Vincent Fean, the former British Consul General in Jerusalem and the former chairman of the Balfour Project. We're doing a year in summary. How has the Palestinian question played out on the international diplomatic stage over this year? Have there been new initiatives, Saudi, Qatari, American? You know, we used to hear about the Saudi peace plan, the Thomas Friedman thing. You know, we've heard about Saudi-Israeli normalization. What is the state of play? And then we know that certain European states have acknowledged Palestinian statehood. I believe that those states are Spain, Norway, and Ireland. What is the implications of these third-party states acknowledging, in theory, Palestinian statehood? What has that accomplished? What has that done? How has that changed the nature of the conflict?
What I think we need, and it's hard to get, is an international conference leading to a framework for resolving the conflict. The international community, in the shape of the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, talks about a two-state solution. Prime Minister Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are implacably opposed to that. That means having an international conference with the active participation of Israel under the present government, and possibly the next one, is impossible. That rather stymies the international community for now. And we're in a US presidential election year, and Israel is a domestic issue in American politics. So radical proposals from the US, not happening.
But why not? We're trying to order the disorder on this program. We've established that you and I see the rights and wrongs of the Israel-Palestine conflict slightly differently. But I think we see the net outcomes quite similarly. I support the two-state solution, the 1967 boundaries, the evacuation of most settlements, territorial swaps, and the correction of historic wrongs done to the Palestinian people, quite similarly to you, I would argue. But I don't see a reason why Biden, as leader of the free world, who's giving not only all these arms, but the political and moral support, can't go to the Knesset and say, in November, you know what, we warned you about a 9/11 trap. It is your mistake to make, but guess what? Behind door number 3, if these 5 Likud MPs resign and we have new elections, is the $100 billion that we can easily print at the Fed and not even influence interest rates by 25 basis points. And all the Israeli students can get their, degrees in Silicon Valley, and the Palestinians are going to get this and that from the Saudis and the Qataris. This is all in the art of the possible. To my mind, it has always differed from the Sudanese or Syrian or even Libyan civil wars in truly being possible. So I just want to push back against the narrative that we all know that Netanyahu is a disorderer. And we know that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are not only evil, but they're morons. In other words, they don't understand things. We can outflank these people. These are not evil geniuses here. They're no smarter than the Ayatollahs, who, by the way, you don't need to know much Farsi to realize they're morons. We should be able to outwit them. Why is it that they are always outwitting us?
Let's talk a little bit about what's possible. I mentioned the elections. I'm not as familiar with the American political scene as you, Jason. But my take from observing it for 30 years from the side is that Israel is such a domestic issue, such a litmus test, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, that in an election year, novelty from an American president is not expected.
So what? But it could gain points. That's the traditional wisdom. But Biden has been damned if you do, damned if you don't. And the uncommitted movement has obviously opposed him and is even still opposing Kamala in Michigan and places like this. And hundreds of thousands of Arab American, Muslim American votes will be lost, while hundreds of thousands of American Jews have taken their votes to the Republicans because Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. So he's been damned if you do and damned if you don't on both sides. Mm-hmm. So the idea that novelty is not respected, I think that the issue has tremendously hurt Democrats and supported disorderers and Republicans. But if we, meaning I'm obviously giving my loyalty here to the Democratic Party, but if we in the center wing of the Democratic Party had said, you know what, we have a novel approach. We are having this conference in Doha, and guess what? These guys are showing up, and we're promising and unveiling this aid package. Oh, and we got the hostages. I think that would move the market. So I get that people are so scared to take risks, and we've talked about it in our episodes about negotiations on this podcast, which is that there was a time in the 1990s where Blair and Jonathan Powell could take risks over Northern Ireland, risks that would have been politically dangerous, but there wasn't social media, and they did them before they were known that they were doing them, and they only came out, the meeting with Martin McGuinness and this, that, and the other, when it had been done. It is more difficult now in the social media age because you're going to be criticized and people are going to push back before it happens. But I don't think that bold diplomacy is impossible merely because there's social media or because it's an election year. And thinking that it is impossible makes it difficult for centrists to order the disorder.
I agree.
Tell us what has happened.
Okay.
So we've talked about what hasn't happened.
Yeah.
What hasn't happened is Biden and Sunak and Olaf Scholz. They haven't gone to the Knesset. They haven't pleaded with the Israeli people. No. And they haven't really had a big conference getting the Qataris and the Saudis all on board for a new initiative. What has happened?
Okay. Well, what has happened is a major split between Israel and its Western supporters on the issue of humanitarian aid into Gaza. That has been a nagging issue throughout the year. The means by which Israel has controlled and helped to destroy Gaza has entailed drip-feeding aid into Gaza against the wishes of Biden, of Cameron, and others. Now that ongoing issue is still with us. The UK under Starmer has recently started to refund the UN Relief Works Agency. That may sound small, but it's real.
Sir Vincent, allow me to interject. Obviously, there's been this huge scandal about UNRWA, but maybe not everyone is aware. The UN Relief and Works Agency is the special agency created to deal with Palestinian refugees. It catalogs them, funds them, educates them, gives international money to them, supports them, recognizes them. But in the wake of the attacks, Israel charged that 12 employees of the agency participated in the October 7th attack, and that as many as 1,300 UNRWA agencies are Hamas members. You could say, well, they made that up, but many countries, including the US, Austria, the UK, stopped funding UNRWA, and then the UN conducted an investigation where it took members to fire 19 UNRWA staff who have been alleged to be involved in the October 7th itself. And the UNRWA Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, acknowledged that there was a problem. So I think UNRWA is totally broken, and I think that that's a common view from the center left to the right in America. And the idea that you can just fund UNRWA is not something I'm comfortable with, and I wouldn't want a British government to do, because it's an example of how the international community has allowed all its aid to be hijacked by Hamas, and in things that are called humanitarian, they're actually used to help the terrorists.
So what has happened is that effort by the international community, particularly the West, to keep 2 million Gazans alive. There hasn't been any political initiative. The stirrings of something from Saudi Arabia, but it never got anywhere. Biden, once upon a time, I think, was talking about a major deal which would involve Israeli-Saudi normalization.
And the October 7th happened deliberately by Hamas and their Iranian supporters to
prevent
prevent
this.
that.
Yes, that's right. No, you're quite right. That was one of their political objectives. So there are lots of things that haven't happened, and it's not easy to point to something good that has happened in the last year. let's talk about the future. We're going to have an interregnum, whether it's between Biden and Trump, God help us, or Biden and Harris. There will be an interregnum. What happened in the interregnum of 2016, when Trump came in, before Trump came in, there was a UN Security Council resolution which declared settlements to be illegal and which asked member states to act. There wasn't a lot of action about it, but a UN Security Council resolution, which was contrary to Israel's wishes, passed with a US abstention. There is some hope in London, and we'll come on to what London can be good at. There is some hope by the drafters of UN Security Council resolutions, who operate from London but are in New York, that there can be another UN Security Council resolution with a US abstention, ideally support, that draws some lines about security, some lines about equal rights, some lines about two states. That, I think, would be good. The problem is trying to ensure that Israel does not reject this framework outright, which a Netanyahu government would be very likely to do. This is where recognition comes in as an issue for the UK and France, probably not today for the Americans, for the reasons I gave about the election and general disposition to be cautious. But for the UK and France, two of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, partners in that endeavour, 2 countries which have not recognised the state of Palestine, whereas more than 140 of the 193 UN member states have done so.
And I want to ask you about this. What does it mean for an African country or Latin American country, or for Spain or Ireland, to recognize Palestinian statehood? You're in the thick of it. You have worked on this issue. I don't think that people who are just reading the news get it. What does it mean to hold an abstract notion when there is no Palestinian state?
Okay. It makes a Palestinian state more likely.
How?
Legally and politically. Legally, you have seen that in the UN General Assembly, not the Security Council, but in the General Assembly, Palestine can muster the majority of UN member states in support of its asks, the asks about two states. That is what's happened with the implementation, if you like, the implementing resolution of that advisory opinion that I touched upon by the ICJ. There was a vote in the UN General Assembly in September in which 124 states voted in favor of implementation of that resolution. You're right to say that if you're Colombia or if you're Chile, you don't get asked much for the recognition. You don't pay much for the recognition. You get some disfavor from Israel, but you don't get much either way. But there is a legal point here. If the ambition of the UN Security Council resolutions 242, 338, 2334, and of the ICJ is that the occupation should cease, which is what withdrawal of Israel back to the 1967 borders that you mentioned means, by negotiation, then recognition of that second state on that land is an indication, a signal that that is what the international community wants to happen, and that's what must happen. Now, it doesn't constrain Israel to withdraw a soldier. It doesn't do that. But it sets the bar for a negotiated peace at the level of two states. And I would say that the United Kingdom, with its history in the region, the Balfour Declaration promising a Jewish homeland, but without damage to the civil and religious rights of the Palestinian indigenous people, that and the conduct of the mandate when Britain, in effect, prevented the emergence of democratic institutions as long as there was an Arab majority. That was the effect of what we did up until 1948. Those two things mean that Britain has a particular responsibility to do more and to seek to influence the US, France, other Western nations, and indeed China and Russia in the UN Security Council, because when Britain left the scene politically in 1948, we handed this hot potato to the UN and said, please sort this out. That ultimately means the UN Security Council, not the UN General Assembly, and that is where the effort should be.
That was a very compelling overview of Britain's role legally and morally in the Israel-Palestine question. After the break, please join us as we hear what Britain can do now. We're back with Sir Vincent, commemorating 1 year since October 7th. We're trying to unpack what is Britain's role over the last 100 years, from 1882, when Zionist settlement began, to the start of the British mandate after World War I, and then the chaotic events of the War of 1948. Does this leave Britain in a position where it is responsible for the mess in the Middle East and has a unique need to focus on coordinating international actors towards a solution?
We certainly had a unique role. I think we still do. Britain took responsibility by ousting the Ottomans, the Turks, from Palestine in 1917. And before then, made some promises to the Sharif of Mecca that Palestine would be part of an Arab nation, promises to the Jewish people, to the Zionists, but to the Jewish people, that there would be a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Promises to the Palestinian indigenous people that they wouldn't be harmed by that. So contradictory promises. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the time of our mandate up until 1948, Britain effectively prevented Arab national aspirations from being realized as long as there was an Arab majority. The Arab majority disappearing with the 1947-48 war. Where does that leave us now? It leaves us with a history, with deep knowledge over generations as to the realities on the ground, and I would say a keen interest, self-interest, in seeing this issue resolved. For all the reasons you gave earlier, Jason, it is stopping other things from happening.
So we've done a little ordering the disorder. I want you to tell our listeners, our mega orderers out there, who they're reading the newspaper, these are informed people. What has Sir Keir's government done differently than Sunak on the Palestinian question? We heard about David Lammy suspending some arms. We've heard some other things at the Labour conference. But what has actually happened?
2 or 3 things. One is the restoration of funding for the UN Relief Works Agency. That's one. That's quite important. The second one may sound small, but nevertheless, in relation to the International Criminal Court and the request by the British chief prosecutor for arrest warrants against 3 Hamas leaders and 2 Israeli politicians, Netanyahu and Gallant. That is before the court now. The British government under Sunak asked the court not to proceed. The incoming Labour government withdrew that request. It remains a question for the court. It isn't over, but Britain has stopped being partisan on the issue. The third is the thing you mentioned, Jason, the small, but I think significant, suspension of 30 arms licenses to
Why
Israel.
is it significant?
It's significant because it calls into question whether, in relation to the Palestinian people, Israel is acting as a good faith actor. 2 reasons were cited by David Lammy in making the decision. One was allegations of mistreatment of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention camps out of Gaza. And the second was the starvation point, the point that aid was not getting into Gaza in the quantities needed to keep 2 million people alive. The government deliberately did not offer an opinion on the conduct of the war, on the military conduct of Israel, saying the evidence needed to be assessed, etc. So they were pushing that back. But on those 2 things, they were clear. And on both of them, there are alleged war crimes. So coming back to what the UK can do, the ability to work in New York with the Americans and the French is real. The other two players of the permanent five, Russia and China, are a hard nut to crack. But I think it's possible, with diplomacy and with effort, to bring them on board for a framework that can lead to this key thing, Palestinian self-determination alongside Israeli self-determination, with all that goes with that, the sovereignty that goes with that. That's a long haul. Netanyahu will not play, but the successor to Netanyahu, whenever he goes, and eventually everybody goes, so he will go. The successor may still be in charge of a country that is so traumatized by 7 October, on the anniversary, that we cannot expect active hope from Israel.
But you know what you didn't mention, Sir Vincent, is how Britain can play in defeating the terrorist disorderers in Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and in Iran. And I think that that's very telling, because seen from an Israeli perspective, listening to your answer, and I'm not Israeli, but I can imagine, having lived there, people would say, oh yeah, that's all well and good. Like all Western two-faced liberals, he wants to twist our arms so that we do more, but they're not busy fighting Hezbollah. They're not busy trying to get the Houthis to stop these rockets. And, oh great, every time that a ship is attacked in the Red Sea, they launch off some missiles that do nothing. How are they getting in the trenches with us? Mm-hmm. So I want to hear, what can Britain do as well to make the region not just safer for Israel, but the region safer for the world? Because the more that this conflict continues like this, the more that it serves as a locus for recruiting for ISIS-like and Al-Qaeda-like groups, or Shi'i-linked crazy men.
There's a fundamental point here. Is there a way of ensuring security for the people of Israel without the need for them always to carry the sword? Mr. Netanyahu has gained office, retained office, and currently is prospering once more by saying, we have to live by the sword. I don't believe that.
I don't either.
I don't think Israel needs to be it needs to be constantly on its guard, that's fine. But to be constantly on the aggressor side, that I don't see. And
but
we can argue about who started what.
The Israeli narrative, which is that Hezbollah has been rearming and doing all this thing and getting the rockets, and the Iranians have transferred tons of missile technology to them. What has Britain and America really done? Have they gone and launched special forces operations to capture those missiles? No. Have the American sanctions on Iran or British sanctions on Iran prevented the Iranians from getting all these missiles and this drone technology? No. So I think we have a bit to answer for here as well. Mm-hmm. And that I just want to reframe the Anglo-American role here. I don't think that the Israelis should be regional policemen. They do a very bad job of it, and when they do it, they radicalize people so much. But inasmuch as they're not going to be regional policemen, there is an extent to which an Anglo-American plus European approach has to not be so laissez-faire that it's like, oh, they can teach all this anti-Semitism in their schools, and they can build drones and do the missiles. Because although not every missile will be fired at the West, these missiles and drones and whatever which are launched at Israel actually make us much less safe in North London and in Manhattan and in Ohio. I think that that argument is quite strong because they create a worldview whereby many groups are beyond the rule of law in terra nullius places like northern Yemen, where there's no governance at all, and people may be using those areas to plot terror attacks, just as Afghanistan was used in the past. So, like, what are we doing, since we did a reasonable job in Raqqa and in northern Iraq to defeat ISIS there? I haven't seen the West really take seriously the growth of these Iranian proxies over the last 20 years. So if someone from the Israeli right comes to me and says, Jason, you speak a good game, but then you didn't back it up, I think that's a very strong counter-argument.
Nobody is saying that Israel cannot defend herself by herself.
No, but I don't think she can, because the Israelis don't have the power in the international system to prevent the Iranians or the Lebanese or the Yemenis from smuggling around these arms. That's what the big boys need to do. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If we want to tell the Israelis, we don't want you launching all these incursions and blowing up billions of dollars of real estate in Beirut, it's not done. It causes hundreds of people to be killed, and it's not good. Then they will say to us, great, make sure that there can be no missiles
coming the other way.
And what have we done?
Yeah.
I haven't seen much, so I want to know.
No. I think that there is this fundamental point about militarism versus negotiated compromise. And the job that I did for 39 years was involved in that latter negotiated compromise, looking at, as they say, the art of the possible. Okay. To challenge you for a second, the 5 Likud MPs, I don't think would defect, but I certainly don't think Biden would ask them to. It would be intervening in the internal affairs of a friend and ally.
But guess what? Netanyahu goes to Congress when Mike Johnson or anyone else invites him, and he intervenes in our internal affairs on behalf of the Republicans. So all bets are off. And it's been more than 2 decades that the Israeli prime minister has been a major player in intervening in U.S. domestic politics, not only on top-table Republican-Democrat issues, but on culture war issues, and on issues about immigration and Muslims in America. So I think it is actually incumbent on Democrats to intervene in Israel to support the center-left. And I'm not just talking Meretz and Shinui, but we could even be supporting sane center-right players in Israel so that we don't have disordering actors like Netanyahu as well as fringe nutcase lunatics like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and we haven't done that. They intervene in our politics, and I think that the Israeli majority, if they were presented with options from their center-left to their center-right, would go for them. But one of the reasons that they aren't presented with those options is American billionaires fund very right-wing Israeli think tanks that produce their judicial reform. And the judicial reform, which was going to cancel Israeli democracy, it was cooked in the States. It wasn't cooked in Israel. So we really owe it to intervene from a democratic perspective in the Israeli politics, and Britain as well.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that Netanyahu has made is to align himself totally, and his people, his political people, with the Republican Party. I'm old enough to remember when Israel was a purely bipartisan issue.
I'm quite a bit younger than you, and I'm old enough to remember that too.
And that's the way it should be, frankly. And he has messed up the relationship between the 2 main political parties in America and Israel by being partisan on the one side. It's very clear that he's waiting for Trump.
Let's come back to ordering the disorder.
Yeah.
So if we could give an overview of this conflict on the anniversary, what has happened over the last year that has changed the 7 or 8 decades of this conflict? And what are the current implications for the future of the Middle East and the world?
I believe that the tragedy of the 7th of October and the retaliation by Israel since has shaken the world and brought this issue, which was dormant for 10 years or more, to the stage where sensible people are saying, we can't do this again, we don't need this again, it has to change. That is a positive. The difficulty is framing a potential outcome that is compatible with the bottom line of Israel and the bottom line of the Palestinians. What the UK can bring is, I hope, common sense. That may not be enough, but some common sense into this mess, and advocacy of an outcome that is better. There is a belief or a conviction in capitals, Western capitals, that if we don't act, then this situation becomes repetitive. Israel is under threat from Hezbollah. I don't call it a strategic threat. One can call it a strategic threat. The means that it uses to suppress the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, we've talked about that, is a means that is not compatible with the actions of a close ally of the West, a close democratic ally of the West. What does that mean? It means that there needs to be a recalibration of the relationship between Western states and Israel as a means of providing a balance of opinion, a cost-benefit analysis, if you like, for the Israeli people that says we don't follow the security track of Netanyahu. We are prepared to look at a promise of mutual security with international guarantees by NATO or whoever can give them, that this situation that we are in can get better without our need to engage in the continued suppression, because we come back to the Palestinian issue, of the Palestinian people. And I don't think it's in the interests of the people of Israel for it to continue.
Exactly. And this is the point that I'd like to end on. Thank you for ordering the disorder with me, Vincent. I think the key point is that from America, Israel needs tough love. And from Europe, it needs an honest conversation and honest brokering, which is that the current path of the securocrats makes Israel less safe, and the policies of the settlers damages not just Palestinians' lives and livelihood and olive gardens, but actually Israel's future. And that this is what friends do. Friends tell friends uncomfortable truths. And the uncomfortable truths are that you can't have your cake and eat it too. And you cannot have these settlements and these outposts and long-term peace and security. And you can't have international recognition in your high-tech industry and these tech unicorns and this ongoing conflict. It simply has to be resolved. And these hard truths with carrots and sticks and ultimatums need to be made, and I think they can be made. It's going to look very different in 2025 when you have a Harris and Starmer administration, by the way, both of whom will be married to Jews, and both of whom have a lot of legitimacy in terms of fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Israel's right to defend itself. But then they also have credibility in understanding the Palestinian issue. If they get together and they say, we're going to crack heads and we're going to work with our Gulfi allies and we're going to lay down the law. But guess what? We're also going to work with you to defeat the Iranian menace, and we're going to prevent the Hezbollah and the Houthis from getting these rockets. I think that it is important to end with a degree of hope. And I could see a Starmer-Harris alliance, particularly given their personal and identity politics, where Harris comes from as someone who is half black and South Asian, where Starmer comes from the lower middle class. He's worked his way up in the world, and he's a lawyer, and he understands the need for international law to govern. I really think that these might be the two people who, if they got fires in their bellies, could get this over the line. So, shall I use that as my privilege of the last word and say it's been a real pleasure ordering the disorder with you, Sir Vincent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jason.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please tap follow. I think you'll really enjoy our Substack. The link to it is in the show notes. And we have a lot of content there about the war in Lebanon, the U.S. presidential debate, and more on October 7th. We're going to have future episodes about conspiratorial anti-Semitism and how that kind of thinking really affects today's politics and is at the root of neopopulism and today's disorder. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. As you get your head around this sober anniversary, I hope you can nonetheless have an orderly week.